Hi, everyone. Happy Mother's Day. My name is Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've shared part of your Mother's Day with us today here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation. So, the Sousa Mendes Foundation honors a hero of World War II, a great rescuer, Aristides de Sousa Mendes, who displayed great moral courage and saved thousands of lives of people that he didn't even know, and he paid a very heavy price. And we've been showing stories, films, and discussions, and book talks, and all kinds of programs about stories of rescue, resistance, and hope for 5 years now, since the beginning of COVID. And we're still going strong. Today, we have a very exciting Mother's Day program for you. And it's the story of a journalist, Karen Frenkel, and her mother, and her grandmother, and her great grandmother, and great great grandmother, and some of the male ancestors as well. She has dug way into her family history, and the filmmaker Marcia Rock has helped her tell her story. Marcia Rock is a professor at NYU. She, I have, let's see, she is the director of news and documentary film at the Journalism Institute at NYU. And she and Karen have put together a beautiful film that you have, I hope, seen. You'll have until tomorrow at 10 p.m. Eastern Time to finish the film if you haven't finished it yet. And you should watch it with your mother or your daughter or anyone else you choose. Everyone should see this film. So the way it's going to work today is you all will remain muted. You certainly will have questions you'll want to pose. We ask you to pose those in the chat box as the program goes along. I will be functioning as your moderator later in the program. We're going to start with a presentation from Karen, and then we're going to see several film clips with discussions before and after the clips by both Karen Frenkel and Marcia Rock. So Karen, please take the floor.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for making this possible and making it such an exceptional Mother's Day to be able to show our film and have people see it and then view this slideshow that I've put together, looking at several generations back of the women in my family. So I will start with the poster for our documentary, and we chose this last photograph of my mother on the right and my grandmother Teofila on the left in May 1939 on their way to the dressmaker. And it was the last picture of them together and before the war. The next picture is of my mother after the war. My mother would have been 101 this year, and this is my favorite picture of her. I thought she was so beautiful and very brilliant, and people even compared her to Ava Gardner. She had green eyes and black hair, and here she's about 22 and newlywed. This is one of the very few pictures that I have of myself with my mom, and it's in our kitchen in Forest Hills. I was about 16 and she was 47. Unfortunately, I don't have any pictures of my mother and my three sisters, my sisters and me. I was going to say the three of us. And my mother was very, very involved in raising us. And if there was a problem, she would leave no stone unturned in her efforts to solve it. And so, for example, when my sisters and I were having trouble spelling, she searched for experts. And when we were diagnosed as dyslexic, my mother read all about it, recognized that she was too, and did eye exercises with us. She helped us to learn how to learn, and her favorite subjects to teach us were history and literature. Here's my mother in Amagansett, where she and my father built their dream house and where they hoped that they would retire. And she's sitting with Gardener's Bay to her back, and she loved the ocean and she loved gardening. And one of the reasons why I say that my mother was brilliant was not because of the way that she was able to survive the war by maintaining her ruse throughout her years as a slave laborer, pretending to be Catholic, but was because she showed business acumen, especially when we went out to Amagansett and we first came there in 1967. She said to my father, you know, you can jump right off the train and drop your things at your house and walk to the beach for a swim. We should buy land here in the village. And my father was reluctant because he was concerned about flooding again of the town as it had flooded in the hurricane of 1938. And but my mother had wanted to invest in the village, and he won out with that house by the bay. This is my great great grandmother, Tauba Sift, who this is really, she goes, I can go back 8 generations, but I can go back six with images. And Tauba was born in 1841, I think, and she was also known as Tina. And this is the record of her birth, which I was able to ferret out from the Warsaw Agad archive. And it reads like a short story. It says a little story. On August 11th, 1841, at 8 in the morning came Samuel David Zift, age 32, from Lovich. Lovich is in central Poland in the Pale. And in the presence of witnesses Davida Halanya, age 48, and Moishek Aaron Rotzenbern, age 45, also from Lovich, declared that today at 4 in the morning, his wife, Leah, age 22, gave birth to a baby girl. And the baby was named Tauba, and after the declaration was read and signed by the witnesses. This is so then signed by the clerk's office in Lovich. I also found through the researcher at Agad the record of her marriage to my great-great-grandfather, Hyman or Herman Levy. But it's more fun to show you his fast car, which he zipped around Breslau with. The family moved from Lovich to Breslau, I don't know when. And this is I don't know actually when it is, but it's a 1905 German-made Argus. And possibly in the back is Sarah, his daughter, my great-grandmother, with a dachshund. And there's a chauffeur on the left. My great-great-grandfather is in the middle, and I'm not sure who the little girl is in the back. So this is my great-grandmother, Sarah Levy, in Breslau. She's probably in her late teens, possibly her early 20s, in 1880. And she was a proto-feminist. She refused a matchmaker and insisted on going to the equivalent of a junior college. And then she chose her husband at the ripe age of 23. Here they are together. This is my great-grandfather, Heinrich, and I don't know whether it's their engagement or their marriage. And then they moved to Krakow, which is where Heinrich was from. These are Sarah's in-laws, Heinrich's parents, Abraham and Leah, another Leah, and they lived in the Jewish section of Krakow. And he was a jeweler. And I don't know anything much about this matriarch, except that she gave birth to 13 children, 6 boys and 7 girls. Here are Heinrich and Sarah's 4 children. Theophila, my grandmother, is on the lower right, and my great uncle Max is to the left. And I knew him, and he helped me with the family history because I was able to correspond with him about the branch in California. This is Isabella on the upper left, the oldest daughter, and Lutza, the baby. And my grandmother, Theophila, and Isabella were lost in the war. In 1912, my great-grandparents commissioned portraits of themselves and their children. This is my great-grandmother um, in her, I call it her Titanic hat because it so matches the style of the hats that were worn at the time. And if you've seen the movie Titanic, it opens up with Kate Winslet wearing an enormous hat, and you don't see her face, and then she tilts up to the camera, and then you see her. And it so reminded me of this, this enormous hat. And the painting does not actually look like this. We uh, altered the brightness so that you could see the outline of her hat and her magnificent outfit. Um, and the painter was Stefan Zarniecki. This is an oil. There's an oil of my great-grandfather as well. And then two pastels were painted, and the portrait of Isa was lost. In the next slide, you see what could be a study for the portrait of my grandmother Teofila on the left and my great aunt Lutza, and they too are wearing huge hats. And they're also wearing these sailor outfits, which are so typical of Polish school children. Here is my grandmother Teofila in the pastel portrait. And she's about 14 here. And once again, it's 1912. Here she is as a young woman in her parents' apartment in Berlin. And with her is her beloved German short-hair pointer, Arco. And on the left, you can see a steamer trunk, which is one of three, I believe, that my great-grandparents packed their belongings into: the photos, the portraits, and many, many documents, the hundreds of portraits that we digitized and used in the film. And I believe that they were sent in advance of their flight from Berlin in the fall of 1940. And this is a favorite portrait of my a favorite photograph of mine of my grandmother, probably in Berlin in the 1920s, certainly. And scroll down here. And here she is engaged to my grandfather, Isidor Goldberger, who was an attorney who had gone to law school in Krakow, and they moved eventually to Krakow shortly after they were married. But when my grandmother Teofila, this is in the next slide, was about to deliver my mother, she wanted to be with her mother in Berlin. My grandparents were living in an oil town called Drohobych in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains, and there was concern about the medical care there. But also, as I said, my grandmother wanted to be with her mother, and so this photograph shows both the closeness between mother and child, and meaning Teofila and her mother, and the infant, my mother, Imena. Then after that, my grandparents settled in Krakow, where my mother was raised, but she had German citizen as a result of this birth in Berlin. In the next slide, we see my mother as a toddler, and there's a Steiff teddy bear. This is a well-known German brand, underscoring, along with Arco, the German pointer, the link to the German culture that existed in my family, though they were from Poland, really. And who knows what the Roosters brand was. Here, my mother and grandmother stroll in Krakow's Plante, which is a plant that encircles the old city in the shape of an upside-down teardrop. And my mother has a hoop, a wooden hoop, which is not a hula hoop, but a kind of ring that children would wheel along as they walked. And my mother is wearing an embroidered Swiss dress that she felt was too fancy and was self-conscious of it, even at that age, about wearing it. Because of the fear of tuberculosis, children at that time were encouraged to take long walks. And my mother's the family maid would take my mother on long walks on Sundays, and that's how she became acquainted with many of the beautiful churches of Krakow. But the maid also showed her the caves outside of Krakow, which in which the very, very poor lived. They were so poor that they couldn't afford to live anywhere else. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why my mother was always concerned about privilege and poverty and so self-conscious about the dress. Here she is with Theophila in a very happy moment, and this is a grin that I remember very well that she often wore, as an adult and mother. And here again is my mother in her Polish sailor outfit as a schoolgirl. And once again, here is um, the the final picture from Krakow, where my mother looks very mature and yet is only 14. Um, as you know from the film, my mother survived partly because she had a false identity, and this is the cover of her false papers, which was a collection of documents. And Arbeitskart means work card, and her alias is Danuta Milewska, who was a Polish girl from Lvov, and the papers were from Lvov or Lvov, now Lviv. Here is my mother as a teenager with her cousin Gushchinka Traumer. There were two Augustas in my family, and Gushchinka is the diminutive that was given to this Augusta, who was very helpful during the war. She was half German and half Jewish, and she was in the resistance and helped guide my grandparents in how to buy the false papers in Lvov. And on the far right of the photograph, there she is as an adult in the late 1940s, I believe. And she is mentioned in Yad Vashem as a righteous Christian for saving my other members of my family as well. Here is my mother's favorite aunt, and my great aunt, Augusta Mandel, but everyone called her Chocha Gusta. And she's the other Augusta. And she was a pediatrician. And when my mother was separated from her family, they had Aunt Gusta request that my mother come to work for her as a medical assistant, which is a way to make it more convincing that she should be allowed to go from Lvov to Tarnow. And she was my mother's role model. My mother considered studying medicine after the war. Here's my mother having fled the Tarnow ghetto and gone to work as a slave laborer in Bad Neustadt. And she is very, very thin, starving because she was denied nutrition by her so-called employers in Bavaria. And this is October 1943. And this photograph was used by my mother as evidence of cruelty and deprivation of liberty when she sued the German government in the late 1950s. She said that she argued that she was so skinny she could have been a concentration camp survivor. Now we switch to my father's side of the family. This is probably around the time that he enrolled in medical school, and he's age 20 in 1933. And he was from Lvov, and here are his parents, my grandmother Michaela, and who was born in a shtetl called Zukau, which was very close to the shtetl where my grandfather Oyer was born. And both of the shtetls were about 30 kilometers from Lviv or Lvov, which is where they settled. Here are is the Frenkel family, and you see my grandmother Michaela on the left and my uncle Milek, whose formal name was Samuel, but we knew of him as Milek, and they were both murdered in the Holocaust. Here are my parents celebrating an evening at the famous Copacabana nightclub in New York in 1947. And here is the photograph of all of us that hung above their bed in the bedroom. And you see my sister Michelle on the left and Ivy on the right, and I'm the blonde in the middle. And here's my mother with two of her three grandchildren. This is Davida on the left and Andy on the right. In the 1980s. Andy was born in 81. And this is my favorite photograph of me and my nieces. Here's Juliana, Ivy's daughter, and Davida looking very much like my mother in this shot. And here are Davida's children in the next slide, Ava in the middle, and Oliver on the right. And that concludes my celebration of the women and mothers and the long line in my family. And this is the cover of my memoir, which ties in with our documentary. And now I'll hand the program over to Marcia Rock, and who's been a great pleasure to work with, and she'll talk about how we produce the films, and then I'll chime in.
Thank you, Karen. So one of the joys of documentary work is to learn about new things and meet new people, alive or not. And one of the pleasures was meeting Karen's mother. Fortunately, she did the oral history with the Fortunoff Video Archive, and we were really, really lucky to have it. So that was the first thing I did, was dive into that to try to understand her mother. And it was interesting because I didn't go for the subtle moments in the beginning. I went for more plot, more description, how to move the story along. And it was interesting, about the middle of the edit, I went back and listened more carefully to her mother and found, I thought, more moving moments, which would be pauses or sighs or incredible remarks that perception is a responsibility, or Hannah Arendt's quote about children seeing things better than elders. And that coincided with Karen's beautiful description of the events that her mother experienced. And we call this the duet of the two telling the stories together. And we have a little clip.
The fact that my mother was forced by her parents to leave them in Lvov and separate to go to Tarnow was a blessing and a curse for her.
That, of course, has had a terrible impact on my whole life.
In early 43, the Soviets defeated the Nazis in an epic battle known as the Battle for Stalingrad, and that was a turning point in the war.
Things changed a little bit for the better. The Germans were not so sure that they will conquer the whole world. 1944, Soviets occupied Lvov. My papers were from Lvov. No one could prove that these were false papers. I rebelled. Simply walked into the labor office, showed them my hands, which are completely black.
These are not the hands of a lazy person, and she had scars, from all the hard work. But evidently the family for whom I work is not satisfied.
Which was not the case at all. I just used psychological warfare and got myself a job in Siemens sugar worker because I knew nobody could check that I was Jewish.
So I'm hoping that you enjoyed, when you watched the film, this intercutting of the two ladies in the family. And it was really a joy to do that. So we'll move on to the next topic, which is about the University of Vienna. Karen's father's story. I found this really an enlightening section of the documentary. And I was fascinated by the research that Karen did, but that I did as well, about the Nazi theorists of the 30s turning for inspiration to us, which is the most successfully race-obsessed country in the world. And I just want to share a little bit about what they learned from us. I'll paraphrase it. They were impressed by lynching and the subordinate caste of African Americans and the ritual torture and mutilations. Hitler marveled at the American knack for maintaining an air of robust innocence in the wake of mass death. He was impressed by segregationists in terms of forbidding interracial marriage, homosexuality, enforcing separate bathrooms, drinking fountains. But Nazis were so puzzled that the US didn't include Jews. And of course, there were quotas here until the 1960s, restricting Jewish enrollment in particularly the Ivy Leagues. And one aspect of Karen's father's story that's so amazing is that he was at the University of Vienna Medical School when a scene took place that is in the novel Julia. Can we show that clip?
By the time my father arrived there were riots all the time because the Austro-fascist students were constantly beating up the Jewish students. And it really was dangerous to go to anatomy lectures given by Professor Tandler, who was the chair of one of two anatomy departments. In the 1870s, there were two approaches. One group of professors favored looking at human anatomy for clinical purposes to better heal patients. The other branch was more interested in ethnic origins of those differences. So you start to see the seeds of their thinking in terms of racial superiority and inferiority. The Anatomy 1 amphitheater was on the second floor of the anatomy building, and you would go up a very elegant flight of marble stairs and turn to the left. The fascistic anatomy students would go up a flight to the right to the second anatomy amphitheater, and there would be lectured by Tandler's counterpart, Eduard Pernkopf, who was a member of the Nazi Party. The violence on campus was extreme, and the historians sent me historical accounts of what happened. They sent me newspaper clippings. And there was a student who was in my father's class who wrote a memoir, and she described one particular episode where the fascist students and brown shirts from Germany, who they invited to join them, invaded Tandler's anatomy amphitheater. Another classmate, Muriel Gardner, mentioned the same riot in her memoir. She was the real Julia, who Lillian Hellman wrote about in a short story that became the movie Julia. And at that time, in March 1938, when the Nazis arrived, it wasn't clear that he would be able to graduate because he was Jewish, and they were throwing out Jewish professors and students. But because my father was a foreign student and the Nazis were not yet interested in Poland, he was able to graduate in June. He left the frenzied streets of Vienna and the Austrians' rapturous embrace of the Nazis for his hometown of Lvov, which was relatively quiet. But I think he knew what was coming, that he had to get out of Europe.
So I'd like to make just 2 points and then have Karen talk about the moment she figured out the Julia connection. One is that being a university professor, I look at that footage now, the photographs, with new interest and a appalling emotion, that a government could take over the university and decide what would be taught. So I'll let that rest with you. The other thing is that I found that clip at the end of the Nazis welcoming Hitler into Vienna, the Anschluss, equally petrifying. They are so enraptured with Hitler and so excited to have him take over their country and for them to be German again, that it's really, really frightening to see what excitement fascism can um, uh, elicit. Karen.
I knew nothing about my father's time in medical school and really anything about his pre-war and pre-war life and what happened when he escaped to the Western Hemisphere and then returned to Europe with the American Army. So it was a tremendous shock for me to learn how much persecution he endured as a student on the trying to attend anatomy lectures in medical school. And that's because my mother had told us something that turned out to be actually not accurate. My sisters and I thought that our father had escaped the university during the Anschluss. There was a myth that he had taken his final oral exams in a taxi on the way to the train station, and that he then went back home to Lvov. And so when I, by chance, Googled my father's, the spelling of my father's first name with the Polish and discovered this site that the historians of the University of Vienna had created, which showed him as a student. And then they began to feed me information about the climate on campus during the ramp up of fascism and Hitler's rule. And through the Anschluss, I asked them, that's really the first thing I asked them, can it be that my father took his final exams on the way to the station? And they said, highly unlikely, because you would have to have had several professors examining you. And they said that they would look for his graduation record, and they proved to me that he had graduated in June of 1938 and then went home. Mm-hmm. So I had seen the movie, just briefly, I had seen the movie Julia, knowing that it's part of it took place at the University of Vienna, but thinking, oh, no, my father didn't experience that. He had already left. So that was quite a revelation.
So I just want to say before we go on to the next clip that Karen and I would love to have your questions, but we would also really appreciate any reactions, any parts of the documentary that moved you, interested you, whatever. It doesn't have to be a question. We would appreciate that feedback. So Karen's going to introduce the next clip. Michaela, it's Michaela.
This is the story of the fate of my grandmother Michaela, and I knew that how she had died, but I wasn't allowed to ask anything about her, and there isn't really very much more to say than that. Let's just roll it.
My grandmother Mechla was blonde and blue-eyed and could pass for not being Jewish. And her newlywed daughter-in-law, my uncle Milek's wife, posed as Polish Catholics. My uncle Milek had been forced to work in a coal gasification plant. They said, if anyone is missing, you'll pay with your life. But he missed his wife, and one night he circuitously came home, but in fact it turned out that he was being watched. The next day, the Gestapo came for my grandmother, Michaela, and her daughter-in-law. My grandmother had been given cyanide by my grandfather. I think he too had a vial, and she chose to swallow it right then and there. It took me many, many years to really understand that this was actually an act of resistance, the last moment where she could exercise free will. She was going to decide how she was going to die. Knowing these small fragments about my grandmother doesn't make me feel better about what happened to her, but I find some solace in knowing a few of the details. And I imagine my grandmother sitting, looking at the passers-by on this charming sunny lane, sipping cafe and eating linzer tort. And I feel that I've honored her by finding out as much as I possibly could. It's unbearable to me when people have the audacity to rewrite history, who claim that the Holocaust never happened, or that not that many people died, and that we should all get over it. With the information that I've uncovered, I can retort and say, this is how my grandmother Michaela died. This is how my grandmother Teofila was shot. There are truths, there are facts, and I found them.
I would just like to comment that while this segment was not only to honor my grandmother Michaela, it also was a moment where I felt that I could, as you see, answer to Holocaust denial. But I would like to focus a little bit on the part about resistance. And in fact, in this line of women, there are several examples of resistance. It was also an act of resistance for my grandparents on my mother's side, and particularly Teofila, to give up their only child and force her to leave them. That was a kind of resistance. And my mother walking out of the Tarnow ghetto, though she there was a chance that she could get through, was most unlikely to be able to pass by through the guards at the gate. And the decision to decide possibly to walk through the gates and possibly to die as she walked through the gates was also a kind of resistance. And I see that now much more clearly than ever before. And so I think that we live in a time, unfortunately, where types of resistance will be necessary, and that's why I call attention to that today.
Thank you, Karen. Marcia, anything you want to add about that? Okay. So audience members, now is your chance to continue putting those questions into the chat box. There are already some very nice questions, but please continue adding them. I'm taking the floor back now to tell you what we have upcoming here at the Sousa Mendes Foundation, and then we will get to your questions. So in the month of June, we have 3 programs upcoming. We have 2 free programs right in a row on the 1st of June and on the 8th of June. And then later in the month, on June 22nd, we have a program for which you need to obtain tickets through a donation, as today. And so let me tell you about those programs. So on Sunday, June 1st, we're coming back to our own story, the Sousa Mendes story. We're showing a film we have not shown before. So even if you've seen other films about Sousa Mendes, you have not seen this one. The film is called The Consul of Bordeaux, and it was a joint production of Portuguese and Belgian television. We will have the filmmaker with us. His name is João Correa. We will also have a woman whose family was rescued by Sousa Mendes, named Elizabeth Eames, to tell you her family story. And we'll have Jan de Moncada, who is one of the great-grandchildren of Sousa Mendes, to tell you the story from the family's perspective. And so, again, that is a free program. Then we have 2 other programs after that. So our other free program is the following week. And there we're talking about superheroes and comic books and their Jewish history. You may not know about the Jewish history of comic books superheroes. So tune in to that program to find out. And then on June 22nd, we are turning to a brave man who shows moral courage today. His name is Ephraim Zuroff, and he'll be joining us from Israel. The film about him is called The Last Nazi Hunter, and that's what he does. He hunts Nazis still today. So first, we're going to show you a little trailer of the film The Consul of Bordeaux that we're bringing to you on June 1st. So let's play that trailer.
Chamo-me Aristides de Sousa Mendes e sou cônsul de Portugal em Bordeaux.
Nací Aaron Appelman en 1926. Tenía 14 años cuando Bélgica fue invadida por los nazis y tuvimos que huir.
E agora o que é que vamos fazer, Esther?
Eu não sei.
Todos os dias chegam judeus às centenas, procurando um visto para Portugal que eu não tenho autorização para emitir.
E onde começa e acaba a sua humanidade, Sr. Cônsul?
Vou passar vistos a todos os que vierem pedir-los, independentemente da religião, nacionalidade, raça ou da situação pessoal.
Ele cobre as nossas instituições de ridículo. Neste momento está a emitir vistos no meio da rua.
Sabe o que acontece se desobedecer a uma ordem direta de Salazar, não sabe?
Sei, mas também sei o que acontece se lhe obedecer.
O senhor foi muito além dos limites, Sousa Mendes. E vai pagar por isso. Vá-se agora de Aristides e leva os seus amigos consigo. Aqui não passa nem mais um.
Mas você está doido?
Temos de nos apressar.
O avião!
São os alemães.
O que querem? A fronteira está fechada.
Nunca o esqueceremos.
O pior já passou.
Okay, so that is the trailer for the film we are showing you around the program on June 1st. And now we're going to show you a little trailer for the film we're showing around the program on June 22nd, The Last Nazi Hunter.
Send people to the river to be murdered. It's not business as usual if someone like Capiro, against whom there is so much evidence, and it's so clear what he did, and he's so guilty that this is a person who shouldn't be allowed to live his life in peace and tranquility, and he has to pay for the crime.
I'm sure you're all wondering where this Shando Capiro lives. Well, why don't you all just look outside the window across the street at that apartment building? That's where he lives.
Okay, so now let's get to your questions. So first of all, there are several questions about how those trash bags filled with pictures and documents got to you, Karen. Can you explain to us again how you came by all these incredible materials?
Sure. My there were two. My grandmother had, as I showed you, three siblings. Two of them survived. My Uncle Max and my Aunt Lutza, and they lived in Washington Heights in the same building. And in Lutza's apartment, which had been my great-grandparents' apartment, those treasures were found after Aunt Lutza died in 1968. And my mother and Lutza's daughter, my mother's cousin, were going through everything, and they discovered this trove in a closet and had no idea that the portraits existed, that there were these hundreds of photographs. Maybe they had seen some of the photographs, but they didn't know that the whole collection was there. And Franca, my mother's cousin, Aunt Lutza's daughter, didn't want any of it. So my mother took it and brought it all home in 1968, and I was about 13 when they arrived. And it was a fantastic moment because my mother was so stunned that there was this likeness of her mother as a schoolgirl, in the pastel that I showed you, and that no one had thought to tell her. And then she said about having them framed and delivered over, who the craft person should be to frame them. And then she hung them in the dining room and the living room.
And Karen speculated to me that perhaps it was just too hard for Heinrich and Sarah to have all these memories about the life that was gone or the children that were gone.
Exactly.
So can you tell us a little bit more about the lawsuit that your mother brought against the German government in the 1950s?
My mother, I don't know anything about the decision that she made when she decided she was going to do that. I have some of the deposition papers, which I had translated for this whole project. We didn't even know that my parents went back to Germany because of the lawsuit. We thought that they had taken several trips. There were several trips to Europe and to Israel, but one of them I discovered was actually to go to Germany for whatever procedure there was. But most of the trial was done in my mother's absence, and one of the reasons why I know about the harsher treatment that she received at the hands of the Opelt family is because of her deposition. There was also a Belgian prisoner of war who was lame and who was working in the produce nursery alongside my mother. They treated him more leniently, and my mother had to do the heavy work, lifting barrels every Friday of produce that were too heavy for her. And she won the lawsuit not as a Jew, but as if she were the Polish slave worker she had impersonated. And that was set a new precedent.
Can you explain a little bit more about that? What does it mean not as a Jew, but as the slave labor? Elaborate what that means?
Well, she was persecuted as if she were a Polish Catholic slave worker. Who knows what they would have done had they figured out, that she was Jewish. I mean, the anecdote, the comment I sometimes receive about this portion where I'm talking about, I'm in the kitchen and I'm stirring the pot and I'm talking about how I reacted to the fact that my mother was called, unfit to handle the flour so intimately of the Opelt family. Imagine what they would have said to her had they known that she was Jewish.
Yes. So, Marcia, you were commenting on Austria and the Anschluss, and someone in the chat is remarking on the concept of Austria being Hitler's first victim. What do you think about that concept?
Karen and I have discussed this, and she helped me understand that Austria was an easy target for Hitler because the Austrians emulated Germany and wanted to be part of the German culture. So it wasn't that surprising. I think it was more of an aggression to go into Czechoslovakia. Karen, do you want to comment on that?
Oh, it really, I mean, there were many Volksdeutsch, the Germans spoke of those who were German speaking but lived in other lands before the war as having a desire to be reunited with other German speaking people. And so it was a test case, I like to think, not so much an easy target, but a test case to see if there would be any resistance.
What I find interesting is when Karen's talking about this German strategy for taking over land with slave laborers, was that they discounted the Poles as not equal to them either. So it wasn't just the Jews. They wanted to empty the land and then have the workers like serfs, I suppose, and then take over the other land for the Germans.
Now, Karen, you really used your investigative skills here as a journalist, but we have several people in our audience who are embarking on their own Jewish family histories. And one audience member has returned to Vienna after 27 years of living in California and is just beginning her research. We have another one doing research on her own family roots in Russia. Of course, now is not exactly the time to travel to Russia, but I wonder if you might have any words of wisdom for these people who are searching for their own Jewish family roots.
I don't know that much about genealogical research in the countries where my family is not from, but I found in the University of Vienna, because of, even though my father was not Austrian, but he loved Austria and he loved Vienna, I found there was tremendous willingness on the part of the historians of the University of Vienna to assist in any way that they possibly could. So, but I did write to the Austrian State Archives to find out about my grandfather's service during World War I. Do think of any possible educational institutions and state-run archives for the person whose family is from Vienna. And there's also a Jewish museum there, which was also helpful to me. And for Russia, if your family was in the Pale, you can still get records from the Warsaw Agad archive, because the Pale was partly in Poland and partly in Belarus and neighboring countries. And I was able to find those records that I showed of my great-great-grandmother Talba and her marriage to Hyman or Herman, who lived initially in the Polish part of the Pale in central Poland, in Lovich, through the Warsaw Agad archive. So that would be, if you think that they were in the part of Russia that was closer to Poland, perhaps that would be a place to start. I'm sorry, I had another thought. Also, there are general sites for genealogical research, like jewishgen.org, which is affiliated with the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. And there's also Gesher Galicia, if your family is from southern Poland. And I'll think of a few more probably as we continue to speak. But if you want to write to me and if something else has occurred to me, I will let you know what else comes to mind.
And I just wanted to comment that when we started production, the way we organized ourselves was to think about the different steps in family history research. So we started with oral history, right? Talking to anyone in your family who knows anything about the history of your family. And then we went to Google anything, just try search. The internet is incredible now. And then once you have a few sources, you deep dive into archives. And then the idea of actually going to the places you've discovered and what you can learn from that. And then the last part is creating a family tree from all the information that you've gathered. And just to point out that we've taken the feature documentary and made it into a 5-part series for high school students based on those 5 steps with a discussion guide.
Yeah, I did none of this in as orderly a fashion as that. No, I would get stuck with one relative and go off and ask a question about another and try to think, what the key words would be to search. Actually, you could just Google, archives in Russia, archives in Ukraine, archives in Poland, archives in Germany, and anywhere else, and see what comes up. But that certainly it's a good idea to start in that order, I think.
Karen, since it is Mother's Day, how do you think your mother would feel about your having written this book and about Marcia having made this film?
I think my mother would have been really, really appreciative and very, very pleased because my mother actually handed me an assignment. I said in 1987, I think it was, that she did the Fortunoff Video Archive, and she didn't want to do it, but I really urged her. And I believe my sister Michelle also urged her to do it. And finally she capitulated. And then since I had asked her to do something, she gave me this assignment and said, maybe someday you'll do something with this. And there were other motivations, but there she was with her suggestion, and how could I not follow through? But the question was how, because by the time I was ready and I had the time, so much had already been done about the Holocaust. And for the memoir, I spent many, many hours debating what was the best way to make a contribution to the literature on the Holocaust. What could I add, to it? And at first, there was an earlier incarnation where it was not a memoir, it was just an account. And the feedback was, well, who are you? Who's the omniscient narrator, and how do you feel? And then it became the memoir.
Okay, so we're right up to the end of the hour, so I would just want to ask you for some brief final remarks, starting with you, Marcia.
Well, it's been quite an experience to dive this deep into the Holocaust, and I'm glad that we covered the story of survivors, because I think it's an uplifting way to understand the great loss. And it was very exciting to talk to Karen. We decided to do an interview to get the story out rather than Karen write a narration. And I think that was one of the best parts of the experience, was to dive deep into Karen's story together.
So Karen, what are you working on now? And what would you like to say in closing to our audience?
I'd just like to add that I wanted very much to tell both my parents' stories. And because my father was a refugee, one of the reasons for his silence was because he felt that his experience paled in comparison to concentration camp victims. And many children of refugees many children of Holocaust survivors, including the children of refugees, know little about their parents' experiences if they left before the war, the refugees. And I wanted to tell that story, and it is very, very relevant today, given that there are 123 million displaced people on the planet. So I broke his silence, and that was hard to do, but I'm so glad that I did. And finally, in terms of what I would like to work on next, mainly we're working on getting the word out about the film and the book, but I would very much like to be paired with a producer or a director and do a narrative series that would be a 5 or 6 part series that could be shown with actors playing the roles of the people that you've seen in the film. the documentary.
Although I can't imagine an improvement over what Marcia has already produced.
Oh, no, it wouldn't be an improvement. It's a completely different genre.
Different medium.
So thank you both for giving us this fabulous presentation today and for the beautiful movie. Thank you, audience. I know your time on Mother's Day is very precious, and you've shared an hour of it with us. So see you on June 1st, everybody. Have a wonderful Mother's Day and the rest of the month of May. See you soon. Be well. Bye-bye, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you for attending. Bye-bye.